Hare Om Namaha. Om Harir Vidatyan Mama Sarvarakshangniastangri Padmaha Padagendra Prishte Dvari Charmasi Gadesha Chapa Pashanthano Ashtagano Ashtabahu Om Purpuva Svaha Tat Saviturvarenyam Pargo Devasyathi Mahi Theo Yonah Prachodayat Yat Pada Palavayuganga Vinataya Kumpa Dwandwe Pranama Samaye Saganari Raja Vighan Vihantu Malamasya Jagatrayasya Govindamadi Purushang Tamahang Pajami. When a supposedly spiritual movement is composed of leaders and followers who all facilitate passions unfettered by the Vedic standard of ethics, there is no such thing as it having the power to check deviation. It devolves eventually and inevitably into just another organized religion. When avarice and personal ambition suffuse the upper echelons of such an organization, it will surely and easily break through the strongest chords of the Vedic injunctions. A Krishna consciousness movement is meant to be the monopoly of pure devotees, and as far as training is concerned, it is meant to attract ethical students, devotees who wish to become honest men and women. It is meant to attract Brahmins. Any devoted transcendentalist has, for decades running, rejected the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, who for about 9 years ruthlessly governed a movement in order to promote their own self-interests. In the process, they persecuted and ostracized godbrothers. And in doing so, they utilized all kinds of unethical principles, such as ego-driven grievance against godbrothers, class envy, imitation of the Uttamadhikari, and resentment against His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. And they did this in order to amass an organization loaded with cheap gurus and cheap disciples. It is not that everything can be laid upon just those 11 men, however, because in the beginning they were all propped up in the formative years by followers and initiates of His Divine Grace through the Prabhupada. In actuality, all of them rejected his desire, his program, and his chief order. The movement was thus hijacked by these men and converted into a vehicle for the fulfillment of their own desires. In the process, they now considered those persecuted godbrothers as enemies, and they ostracized them effectively because those godbrothers and godsisters did not recognize them as actually greatly advanced devotees and were not willing to worship them, were not willing to glorify them. And after the godbrothers and godsisters were ostracized, a new cult emerged, one that was very much like a fool's paradise, facilitating all these new people as well as the great leaders. And it has degenerated now into a dumbed-down mutual admiration society. Now, the illusions that kept this movement going had to be fed somehow or other, and in the beginning, they were fed by the prior dynamism of the movement before it became deviated. And after that, this new movement was fed off of the concocted new dispensation, the concocted juggernaut that served its elite's agenda. In effect, it became a utopian vision, and just like all utopian visions, they're very similar. They require similar actions and structures. It required a centralized power to enforce the vision of transformation on the whole society. And as a common theme being part of that, it had to have a vanguard or a power clique to introduce all of these new transformations in order to protect the newly created congregation, which was intentionally kept at the A, B, C, D level of knowledge so that it allegedly required that protection. That particular so-called Krishna movement devolved into a manipulative machine of human cruelty, primarily benefiting unqualified men. Censorship had to put down deep roots because dissent could not be tolerated. If there was dissent, the system could collapse, and in the mid-'80s it almost did collapse when it became common knowledge that those 11 men were never at any time appointed by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada as Diksha Gurus. Although in 1978, this was the propaganda that was imposed upon everyone in the society by those men and by the governing body of the organization. So for about a decade after 1978, it functioned as a closed society and also covertly as a kind of surveillance state. As could only be expected, this cult produced cronyism, corruption, censorship, and coercion. And all of these negative energies continue in it up to the present time. It really functioned as a collectivist astral hive, one which, like the Borg of Star Trek, devoured, or at least attempted to devour, anything that chanced to come into contact with it. It absorbed those devotees who actually dedicated themselves to it, and those new people were thus erased from their former identity of being genuine seekers of spiritual life. A state of silence was imposed upon the movement by its leaders because no one was allowed to question the roots of its credibility. There is a reason for that, because at the root of its so-called credibility was lies. When those lies finally were brought to the light of day, then the organization quickly transformed itself into something else, going heavy collegiate in public and heavy Hindu in private. Either way, the devotees who joined it at that time were still disconnected from the Vedic and Vaishnava truths that were supposed to be underlying it, but which, in point of fact, were not. Those devotees all along, even before the second transformation, were controlled by suppressive personalities, some of whom were sociopaths, and they all governed the emergence of a new cult of psychic slavery. All the inexperienced newcomers were jammed into an astral can of worms, and they were covered over by the lacuna of the cult's propaganda or by its official charisma, and as such they were relegated to a bizarre state of social isolation. Many of them, perhaps even most of them, had doubts about the authenticity of their society, but they could not share those doubts with one another for fear of a dire backlash if they did. As such, although they could yuck it up with one another, they really had to accept the fact that they were now all individually atomized, and if they didn't accept that fact, they would have to accept the prospect of being ostracized. The net effect of the cataclysmic deviation of 1978 is that it created a particular dearth of knowledge, a vacuum of knowledge, along with amnesia of its own history. Those voids were powerful enough to create a vacuum that most of the devotees within that movement could not resist the initial transformation, nor could they show any resistance to the two transformations that have since followed it in order to compensate for the fact that the first one is now fully exposed. So in this particular discourse, we are going to consider whether or not the ISKCON movement is still bona fide, or whether there's something else, an ISKCON movement with quotation marks around the acronym, which is now functioning and has been functioning for the past 39 years or more. We're going to take this raw nerve issue on because those who believe that ISKCON is always pure and is still functioning purely, but it's just covered over like bad elements floating in the Ganges, or that it's still a pure gusher of water coming out from an artesian well, but the well right now has a cow lodged in it. These kind of sentiments, and often they're not just sentiments but fanaticisms, are held by many devotees. But we have to consult Prabhupada. We have to consult what he says in his letters on this topic. And when we do, free from bias, free from prejudice, we'll clearly see that what we have been experiencing for the past decades is not Prabhupada's original ISKCON movement, but something else entirely which pretends to be that ISKCON movement. Now, the famed Irish poet and writer William Butler Yeats, he once had a very excellent aphorism which consisted only of 5 words. Things reveal themselves while passing away. Things reveal themselves passing away. That's the situation now. Because the fabricated so-called ISKCON movement is revealing itself more and more every year as it is gradually fading into oblivion. Superficially, of course, it's expanding. Horizontal expansion in the form of satellite centers, which are primarily meant for revenue enhancement. But we're not too concerned about superficial appearances. We're more concerned to understand exactly what it is, and we're going to do that now in the context of Prabhupada's letters on this topic. First of all, we have this letter to a follower in May of 1970. I am surprised how you have been so befooled as to accept an ordinary man as Krishna. Anyway, Krishna has saved you by causing your failure in the examination. Otherwise, you would have been more entrapped by the spell of this so-called Krishna. Now, although there's a number of topics that could be taken up on the basis of this excerpt, we're going to go with those last words, so-called Krishna. So there can be an imitation Krishna. There can be a so-called Krishna. Is there anything more absolute than Krishna? Krishna is the supreme absolute entity. Yet, there can be a so-called Krishna. And in that letter, Prabhupada put quotation marks around the word Krishna. And we know that if we type into the folio imitation Krishna, those 2 words, it'll pull up 16 references. Besides that, in Krishna Lila, there was the story of Pandraka, the warrior king who had 4 arms and said he was Vishnu. He was an imitation Vishnu. And of course, we all know that Krishna killed him. So the point here is that there can be a so-called Krishna, but Krishna being absolute, does a so-called Krishna be absolute or is it material? Of course it's material. Which brings us to ISKCON. This sentiment or fanaticism that ISKCON is automatically absolute, where is this founded? Did Prabhupada ever specifically say that? Did he ever specifically guarantee that his movement was absolute? Why then did he incorporate the BBT separately? And why did he not then incorporate the GBC? He kept all these entities separate. ISKCON movement was never given the power to be absolute. Now, if its leading secretaries had remained bona fide and had not deviated, then surely the ISKCON movement would be the vehicle to spread Lord Chaitanya's movement, as predicted by the Lord himself. But they didn't. They didn't stay free from deviation. In fact, they perpetrated a colossal hoax, a cataclysmic deviation. And it's still going on. There's been transformations, but nothing has been uprooted. In other words, a so-called Krishna can exist and a so-called ISKCON can exist. But we'll delve more into it. Let's go to the next letter. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has said that this chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra will be heard in every nook and cranny of the globe. He is God, so there is no doubt about it. So if we are intelligent, we will take advantage of this opportunity and get the credit. If we do not, someone else will. Now, we're supposed to accept that letter to that governing body commissioner in Southern California in late 1970. We're supposed to accept that as just encouragement. Of course, in and of itself, it's not very encouraging. But instead, we should accept it as mukhya vritti, directly, what it's stating. He's saying his ISKCON movement, or the ISKCON movement, whichever you want to think of, may not be the vehicle to spread Lord Chaitanya's movement to every nook and cranny of the world, the Hare Krishna mantra. But it'll still take place. But it'll take place by someone else, he says. And someone else would also mean some other institution. Right now, if you look at the situation, how can anybody conclude that it's otherwise? So let us continue on with understanding ISKCON as it is. We're now going to go to a letter in late 1972 written to one of Prabhupada's governing body commissioners. He says, once before you wanted to do something centralizing with your GBC meeting, and if I did not interfere, the whole thing would have been killed. If I did not interfere, the whole thing would have been killed. He's talking, when he says the whole thing, he's talking about his ISKCON movement. It's referencing an event that took place in the late winter and early spring of 1972 when 8 of the 12 governing body commissioners engaged in an unauthorized ad hoc meeting in New York and made some very major changes. We're going to be covering all of that in a future discourse, so right now we don't have to do it. But Prabhupada found out about it, and he immediately disapproved of the meeting. He said that all the decisions should be reversed, and he suspended the governing body for a time. In other words, took away their power and gave it all back to the temple presidents and secretaries and treasurers as it was previous to the formation of the governing body in 1970. So in 1972, there was this deviation from Prabhupada that could have killed his movement while he was still physically present. What to speak of after he leaves? But what we need to do is focus upon the verb kill, or the participle killed. if something is killed, does it come back to life? We're not talking about Jon Snow here, and we're not talking about some medieval mythic science fiction tale. We're talking about things that are killed on this plane. If they're killed, they aren't going to come back to life. He said that his movement could be killed, and something that went down in early 1972, not nearly as severe of a deviation as what went down in early 1978, he says it had the potential to kill his movement if he had not intervened. And remember, he intervened strongly and effectively. He was personally present to do so. He was not physically manifest in the last week of March 1978. Again now, we've seen so-called Krishna, which means that can be applied to so-called ISKCON. We have seen that his movement can be killed. So let us now take a look at Sri Upanishad and what he says in his purport to Mantra 13 of the Upanishad. Such accomplishments are possible only when one worships the real Krishna and not some fabricated Krishna invented by foolish men without knowledge of the intricacies of the science of Krishna. Again, in this excerpt from his books, Krishna has quotation marks on each side of the word. Fabricated Krishna. When something is fabricated, it's constructed in a different way. So there can be a so-called Krishna. There can be a fabricated Krishna. If there can be that for the Supreme Absolute Lord, who for eternity is absolute, from here to eternity, there is Lord Krishna. That's guaranteed. So if there can be a so-called Krishna, a fabricated Krishna, then how can anybody reasonably say, someone who is free from bias and prejudice, that there cannot be a fabricated so-called Krishna or a fabricated so-called ISKCON movement or confederation? Now I want to bring up a tangential point here in relation to this excerpt from Sri Upanishad. This publication was put out by Krishna Books, which is a little disturbing. It's a 2013 copyright, although it goes back to 1969 according to what it says. Now, in the book itself, it says such achievements are possible only by worshiping the real Krishna and not by worshiping some fabricated Krishna inaugurated by foolish men who are without knowledge of the intricacies of the science of Krishna. There's some changes here. Now, in the folio, it says such accomplishments, and here it says such achievements. In the folio, it says fabricated Krishna invented by. Here it says fabricated Krishna inaugurated by. There's one other minor change. It's a big problem. Arsha Prayoga, the importance of the original writings of the spiritual master, especially in his books. There's been massive changes, well over 700 changes to Bhagavad Gita. Some of them were corrections, not that many, some were. Many of them, others were not corrections, but were at best unnecessary, and at worst actually were changes. So here we have two different versions, the folio version and the Krishna book version. As for what BBTI puts out, that's another thing. I don't have those books. So the point here is that there can be a fabricated Krishna, and it's stated as such in the Upanishad by Prabhupada in his purport. That means there can be a fabricated ISKCON. So let us delve more fully into it. He writes to one of his Northeast Temple presidents in 1973, early 1973, if we simply go on expanding and there are no qualified men to lead, then everything will be spoiled eventually. Spoiled has been used more than once. He says to a sannyasi in 1974, we have worked very hard and established a great institution, but if we think for our personal benefit, then it will become ruined. This is my only concern. Well, he had every right to be concerned. Spoiled, ruined, killed. These words are used repeatedly. What does it mean when something is spoiled? And then we see here that it will eventually be ruined. Well, we're 39 years into it. So time is a causal factor both in human society and universally. And time changes things. So time has passed. That eventually has come to be what it is now, and we can see it. So, when something is spoiled, what does that mean? Do we eat spoiled food? Do we offer spoiled food? Well, let's use the analogy of a very ripe apple. You know, it gets quite hot in late August in northern Illinois and to some degree in southern Wisconsin. So a lot of apple trees in Wisconsin. So let us picture in the first week of September, and it's very hot, and there's an apple tree, low-hanging fruit, and a really nice-looking red ripe apple, and it falls off the tree. It breaks its hold. So it lands on the ground. Now, if you spot it within the first hour or even within the second hour, it still looks just like it looked when it was on the tree. But in due course, although it's a great-looking apple and you can offer it to the Lord and eat it, it'll be fully nutritious, lots of vitamin C. In due course, that apple is going to start to transform. It's going to start to spoil. And when it does, you gotta, maybe on the second day if you spot it, you can cut the bad parts out where the bruise was from where it fell and where a worm got in, and you can still bail out half of it perhaps. But at a certain point it'll have more than one worm and it'll change color, it won't look good at all, and maggots may even start to get in there. And then the putrefaction sets in completely by the third and fourth day, and it doesn't even look like an apple anymore. It's called spoiled. It was spoiling, and then at a certain point it's spoiled. You can't bail it out. So in the same way, Prabhupada used the term spoiled as a warning. It was not used as an impetus. It was not used as a vague, meaningless threat in order that tighten things up now. These kind of rationalizations won't do. He warned that his movement could be killed. He warned that his movement could be ruined. He warned that his movement could be spoiled. And we have all the evidence in front of us for decades now that it has been transformed 3 times. Let us read another letter here. This was to another governing body commissioner. Not this one. This was to another governing body commissioner who was headquartered mostly in Hawaii and Japan. 1975, end of September. Why is there this politics? This is not good. If politics come, then the preaching will be stopped. That is the difficulty. As soon as politics come, everything is spoiled. As soon as politics come, everything is spoiled. Even before Prabhupada left, there was a lot of campus politics in his movement. But after he left, it exploded big time. How could it not? Those 11 men were never authorized to do what they did, and they took complete control of the whole world and all the temples. A summary here is required, and it is not difficult to understand. We've already touched upon it. Namely, is that for something to remain absolute, it has to remain connected to its absolute source. It has to remain purely connected to its absolute source to remain absolute, especially at the leadership level. Some inebrieties can be tolerated at the level of Chela or Kick Me or Space Cadet. These men are being trained. If it was BONAFIDE, they'll have some problems. That's to be expected. All the newcomers, including Prabhupada's initial disciples, generally had such problems. But at the leadership level, in order for a movement to continue without being spoiled, in order for a movement to remain absolute, you cannot have major deviations at the top. So, in order to summarize, we come back to the acronym ISKCON. When Prabhupada first started his movement, there was not an ISKCON. But there quickly was. By the summer of 1966, when he had his initial disciples in New York City, one of his followers, who never became an initiate, was his attorney. That fellow was a young man, was a barrister there in New York City, and he was chanting Hare Krishna on beads, and he helped Prabhupada incorporate the ISKCON movement, ISKCON being an acronym for International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The vast majority of you watching this know that already. And the GBC was formed almost exactly 4 years later in the summer of 1970. The ISKCON movement, at the time Prabhupada formed it, was naturally his extension. Therefore, it was absolute. It functioned in an absolute way. If mistakes were made, he could rectify those mistakes. If intentional disobedience of his orders was made, then he could take a different step to make sure that the contamination didn't enter into his movement. And he did these things. There was a major disobedience by his first sannyasi right after receiving sannyas in India. For all practical purposes, Prabhupada ostracized him, as well as the initial devotee who joined him, one of Prabhupada's first devotees, arguably actually his first devotee. But the movement remained absolute, ISKCON remained absolute, and expanded exponentially because the real workers, including the leaders at that time, were engaged in strong bhakti yoga. You could call it karma yoga, but because it was given to Prabhupada, it was bhakti yoga. And of course, they were all chanting, we were all chanting Hare Krishna mantra at least 16 rounds a day, engaged in severe tapasya, frankly. So the movement remained bona fide, ISKCON remained absolute. It was in a position to continue that way, but then major deviations took place. Let us not forget that 5,100 years ago, Lord Krishna said in Bhagavad Gita that his movement, his line had been lost, been scattered, nashta. And that's when human beings were far, far more advanced than they are now. Far stronger, far more memory, far more dedicated to their causes. Yet, the sampradaya became dissipated and no longer was functioning, so it was reestablished with Arjuna. This initial deviation was so severe it cannot be dismissed in a cavalier fashion. Let us remember that there's still a chain going on connected to it. There's even some of the original 11 Pretender Mahabhagavats who are still bona fide initiating gurus in the fabricated so-called ISKCON. That means that downline, as all these other institutional gurus were either voted in or appointed or received their no objection certificate to be so-called Diksha gurus. It means that the chain goes all the way back to March 1978. It's still unbroken. The other transformations didn't go to the roots. And what was the main deviation? Well, we could describe that in so many different ways, but let's just get a hint about it here from the Srimad Bhagavatam. This is a purport to Canto 5, Chapter 12, Text 14. If one always follows the orders of the spiritual master, there is no question of falling down. As soon as a foolish disciple tries to overtake his spiritual master and becomes ambitious to occupy his post, he immediately falls down. Yasya prasadad bhagavat prasado, yasya prasadana gati kutopi. If the spiritual master is considered an ordinary man, the disciple surely loses his chance to advance further. And somebody who has the audacity, while still in the modes, to imitate the Mahabhagavat certainly considers Prabhupada an ordinary man. Otherwise, nobody would do such a thing. It was a colossal deviation. And it rendered a change to the absolute status of ISKCON, because ISKCON was under the control of the governing body. And ISKCON, wherever you went in the world, you had a Pretender Mahabhagavat in the 11 zones, the zonal acharyas, a concoction introduced by Fuddy-Duddy. The point of the matter here is that what we have now is something different. We have a so-called ISKCON. We have a pseudo-ISKCON. In one of Prabhupada's letters, he referred to it as ISKCON FISKCON. He said, ISKCON FISKCON, just educate the devotees. Just train them. On a more humorous note, some call it, the new movement, they call it, it's gone. Or it's a con. But the fabricated so-called ISKCON can simply be referred to as ISKCON with quotation marks on each side of it. And if ISKCON without the quotation marks, Prabhupada's original movement, has been ruined, has been spoiled, has been killed, it doesn't exist anymore. That's what transformation means, change of existence. So let us then segue into what should be our attitude in relation to the current so-called fabricated, so-called ISKCON. Is it a cause of liberation, joining that movement? Or is it a root cause of bondage if you join it? Remember, the root cause of bondage is Maya, our illusion. And we're surrounded by illusions, both internally and externally. We remain in the repeated cycle of birth and death whenever we accept deceit and illusion as truth and reality. You have to be able to recognize this root cause, especially when it is in a manifest form. You must be able to see it for what it is, and you must be able to feel it for what it is. What you have to be able to see now is that an ecclesiological paradigm has been put into place in order to facilitate institutional gurus and priests in an imitation show of devotional service. This has gone on before in the world, in previous epochs. It is not a new thing, although this one in particular has its unprecedented features. Besides the make show, there is also the claim that they have the monopoly to the connection to Srila Prabhupada and his disciplic succession, his branch of the line. Nothing can really be confronted until we confront this. And in order to confront it, you have to dismiss the current make show and call it what it is, ISKCON. You have to see where it is stemming from, what it means, and how malefic it really is. You have to feel it. And if you're still under the influence of it, if you can honestly admit that to yourself, then you must want to desire to get free from it. For example, George Orwell put it very concisely. In an age of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. You're being given the truth. There's risk, and there's a revolutionary element in being given the truth at this time. We've had so much falsity imposed upon us. You have to want to get out of it. Now, we have all heard the term liberation, but in Sanskrit the term for liberation is mukti. Most of you have heard that also. Mukti is achieved at true Brahman realization, the first stage of God realization. So, you must desire freedom. Now, the argument will be given, no, Prabhupada didn't want us to desire mukti. To desire mukti is sayuja mukti, and to try to reach sayuja mukti alone, no, that's not, Vaishnavas don't do that. But in regard to this illusory concept, this misconception, this avidya, that Prabhupada didn't want his disciples to realize mukti on their way to realizing higher features of the Absolute Truth, the personal features, then let us take a look at what he says in the 5th canto on this topic. This is Canto 5, Chapter 11, Text 4. Devotional service means mukti, freedom from material entanglement. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, sagunan samatityaitan brahmabhujaya kalpate. One must come to the transcendental platform, otherwise life's mission is never fulfilled. We need to want to get out of all material entanglements. And right now, as far as bhaktas and bhaktins are concerned, the most dangerous and obvious entanglement is these splinter groups that have come off the original deviation. And the great kahuna, the big kahuna amongst them, of course, is the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. We have to see it as it is. We want to be free from its influence. We should want mukti, freedom from its influence, as part of our devotional service and fulfillment of life's mission to attain the spiritual world of form and activity. So as stated by Lord Krishna near the end of Bhagavad Gita in the 18th chapter, iti te jnanam akhyatan guyad guyatarang maya vimrishyaita sheshena yatech chasi tatakuru. So I delivered this knowledge to you today in this particular discourse. Deliberate on it fully. Deliberate on it fully with your intelligence as far as your intelligence goes. and then do what you're going to do. Tattvamasi, you are non-different from the absolute truth in quality, but not in quantity. Sadeva Samya